Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Mallon. Welcome to this Friends at Home event with Gabrielle Selz. We'll be discussing her book, Light on Fire, The Life and Art of Sam Francis. We come to you today courtesy of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library in Alameda, California. The Friends is a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for our outstanding public library in Alameda. You won't be surprised to learn that we appreciate your donations. A little later in the event, you'll see a donation link in the chat thread. We appreciate all your donations, large and small, and you can learn more about us at alamedafriends.com. This is a live webinar, and we are recording. Your audio and video have been turned off. We ask that you use the chat to introduce yourself and to ask questions. We'll monitor the chat for those questions, and we ask that you use that chat responsibly and respectfully. Our guest today is Gabrielle Selz. She grew up immersed in the art world. Her father, Peter Selz, was the chief curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the late 1950s and 60s. Gabrielle grew up in a home full of the most celebrated artists of the day: Rothko, de Kooning, Giacometti, and Christo, among others. Her first book, Unstill Life, is a memoir detailing those heady times. She's contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and Newsday. She's a recipient of the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Nonfiction and is a mock Story Slam winner. Her latest book, Light on Fire, focuses on one of the artists she met during her father's MoMA tenure, San Francisco's own Sam Francis. Sam's career and art take him from the early days where he was working in abstract expressionism through Eastern modes and all the way through the end of the 20th century, traveling the world in pursuit of his muse. Gabrielle, thanks so much for joining us today. You've prepared a fantastic introduction to the life and art of Sam Francis. Let's begin with that, and then we'll discuss Sam and your process of writing this fascinating biography.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, David and Karen, and the Friends of the Alameda Library, and everybody who's listening. I'm going to share a screen and talk a little bit, sort of an overview of Sam, and then I'm going to get it and talk a little bit about what my introduction and introduction into his world and life was, and then I'll sort of run you through some wonderful photographs of his life. So right now I'm going to share my screen, which is always interesting for me to do. Okay, so Sam Francis was this sort of legendary artist. He was one of the pantheons that ascended to prominence in the post-World War II era. He was born in California in 1923 and shot to fame in 1950 in Paris after only 5 years of painting. He lived on 3 continents. He helped put Los Angeles on the map as a global art center by helping establish the Museum of Contemporary Art. So one of the things that really interested me about Sam was that he was much more than an artist. He was a bridge between cultures, countries, and styles of art. He was a virtuoso with color and white space. He had a lyrical hand, and he created these sort of audacious, massive canvases. He also established a publishing company, a printing press. He helped produce, or he did produce, a movie documentary on Carl Jung. He established an alternative medical research center during the AIDS crisis, one of the first wind turbine energy companies in the country. And Sam, about the time right after I had met Sam, he had just finished painting this Berlin Red, which is the single largest canvas in the world. And so I knew him as this kind of larger than life character, but Sam was this little man. He was only 5 feet 6 inches tall. He was sort of shaped like a round Buddha. And yet he worked on these large, huge canvases. Here is Sam painting the top little, I'll go back and show you the top right section of the canvas. He's working, and that's the size of that canvas. He was also one of the first global artists. And I got to know Sam when my father was at the Museum of Modern Art, and Sam came in and introduced himself, and they were planning a big show at MoMA. The show never happened because my father left MoMA and went out to Berkeley. But then my dad proceeded to write this monograph on Sam Francis, and Sam gifted my dad with the painting in the background. That's my dad sitting in front of it. It's called Iris. And so I grew up looking at that painting, and it was sort of a really unique painting. It's a very strong painting, but it had this sort of very, very vital, intense, potent white center. And I had heard stories all about Sam my entire life. I had met him, I met his family. There's, crazy stories about this pilot who was gonna fly a plane into, he wanted to marry the daughter of one of his collectors, and he was gonna fly a plane kamikaze style into this guy's house and blow them all up because the guy was refusing to let him marry his daughter. I had heard all these outlandish tales about Sam. And after I finished my first book, I learned that much of the mythology around Sam wasn't true. And so I really wanted to figure out who he was. And I started hearing the real story about Sam Francis, which to me was more interesting and actually more somewhat mythological in some ways than what really happened than the stories he had fabricated. And so Sam life started out fairly idyllically. He was born in San Mateo in 1923. He had this sort of very charmed childhood until he was about 12 years old. And when he was 12 years old, his mother died of a heart attack. And 6 months later, a little boy named Roy Powers brought a pistol to school, and they were all playing with it. They thought it was broken, and it accidentally went off in Sam's hand and killed the boy Roy Powers. And Roy was Sam's best friend. So he accidentally shot and killed his best friend. The incident was in all the newspapers, and Sam's father decided that he needed to get Sam away from the area. So he drove Sam and his little brother, George. Here's Sam, and this is his little brother, George, and their two cousins. He drove them all the way across the country from California to the East Coast, and they went over to Newfoundland. They crossed over into Newfoundland, where his father was from. And they were staying in a place on the Avalon Peninsula called Broad Cove. And it was a place called right along Iceberg Alley, because you could literally look out the window and see icebergs floating by. And this was a trip that they made back and forth across the country in 1936 in the middle of the Dust Bowl, the hottest summer in recorded history in America. And there were no paved roads, and they were in a non-air conditioned car. So they made this incredible journey, and those traumatic events, then leaving that space and going to someplace else and seeing these incredible sights, really had an impact on Sam that would sort of show up in his art and show up in the way he conducted his life for the rest of his life. He became a great wanderer. He would always leave a situation and go to a new place when things were difficult or complicated, but they would also engender new visions. And the trip also gave him this incredible internal sense of space and landscape. So then, just briefly, Sam, he went to, this is one of my favorite pictures, but he went to Berkeley to college, and he was studying pre-med, and he joined the Air Corps because of the war, and joined the Air Corps in 1942. And within a year, or actually right away, he became really ill, various illnesses, fevers and toothaches, and just his body began to fall apart. And it took them a year. They finally diagnosed him with spinal tuberculosis, Pott's disease. And he had surgery. Part of his spine was removed and replaced with part of his femur. And he was encased in a plastic corset and sandwiched between two sheets of canvas. Literally, he was rolled in canvas and suspended above another cot below him. It was called the Bradford frame bed. And he was so bored that he, started to go a little crazy. And eventually he was given a set of watercolor paints, and he started to paint. And he dreamed he would become a painter, and he set his mind to it, and he painted 16 hours a day. He was basically laid up in this position, in this condition for 3 years. So he's in the hospital, he's painting, nurses are his assistants, they're also his models, people are bringing him brushes. This was Sam's introduction to art. And he was pretty isolated when he did this. He went through he looked at art books. He actually was visited by the artist David Park, who eventually brought him paintings to look at. And he went out in the world and saw some paintings, but it was pretty limited in the beginning. Eventually he went back to Berkeley. He married his childhood sweetheart. And I should say that Sam, there are a lot of pictures of different women in here because Sam was married 5 times. This was also part of his restless spirit. So he marries his first wife, Vera, and he returns to Berkeley as an art student this time. And within 2 years, he's finished his BA and his master's. And it's in Berkeley, that he sort of evolves his first style of painting. And this is a painting called Forfred, and it encompasses lessons he learned that he picked up from, observing the work of Clyfford Still and the work of Rothko. These were not his teachers, but he picked up a lot of their influences. You can see the rectangular shapes of Rothko, and there was this sort of size and drama of a still painting. He's also studied and worked with and been taught by the painter Edward Courbet, who did these very diffuse atmospheric paintings. And you can see Sam's technique is very, painting, his touch is very light and diffuse. And he picks this up, and this is really his first style of work that's a Sam Francis that, we look at and we recognize his work. And it's right before he goes to Paris. He goes to Paris with a woman named Muriel, who would become his second wife. He has already split from his first wife. And he goes to Paris and he lives, they get a room in the Hotel de Seine, which is the Latin Quarter. And it's a 10 by 10 foot room, a teeny little room. And Sam starts painting right away, a painting series called the White Series, which he becomes really well known for almost overnight. And he does these paintings in this very small room by putting the canvases, positioning them up over the sink. Some of the canvases are so large that he has to only paint them a section at a time. He keeps them rolled up under his bed. And this is how he works, and he does his first series of paintings. And here's one of them. He says that white paint was the cheapest, the only paint he could afford to buy. So mostly they're made out of white. They also have other colors in them. You can see behind them. But the white also refers to Sam's experience of being laid up in the hospital because he was in a white corset. He was wrapped up in white sheets. He was looking at a white wall. He was looking at a white ceiling that literally bled color. And so they reference that experience. They also reference this idea that keeps coming up in Sam's work, which is this idea that space is not empty. It's almost like particle physics. It's a charged field. And these are shown right away, and Sam gets renowned. And then here's a picture of Sam on the left, hiding behind a black painting and a white painting. His next series were very dark paintings. Again, just like the white paintings were not entirely white, these were not entirely black. They were made up of many colors. Often, like the one red and black on the right, they have elements of color peeking through, almost bursting through the black, like stained glass. Sam was looking, he was right around the corner from the Gothic cathedrals in Paris, and he was looking at those windows. He does these, and then he goes on to a series of paintings that are almost all solidly one color. This is Big Red. For years it belongs to the Museum of Modern Art. It was the first painting of Sam's to be acquired by a museum. And for years it used to hang at the bottom of the escalator at MoMA. And in this painting, you really see that Sam is pulling from a lot of different sources. So he's bridging it. He was influenced a lot in this painting, like many artists were at that time, by Matisse's painting Red Studio. He's also influenced by Rothko. And again, it has those cellular shapes that Sam's been working with. And you can see the black has almost disappeared behind the red. So then Sam, this is actually out of order. Sorry. Sam does he does a series one of the first of a series of triptychs. This is the Basel Mural triptych. He paints this in Paris right before, as his marriage to Muriel is breaking up and as he's about to go around the world. And you can also see in this space, the color is really broken up by white. This is a gorgeous canvas. One of the canvases of this triptych is in the Pasadena Museum in Pasadena, down in Los Angeles. You can see these white spaces opening up. Sam had just flown back from New York when he went set to work on this painting, and he'd flown for the first time over the water and the Atlantic. And so you can see these land masses. It's a metaphorical landscape. It's also a painting that's talking about matter and spirit. Sam was one of the few artists this time who were really working to bridge with the idea of bridging matter and spirit and incorporating spirit and the spiritual in his work. So he leaves Paris and he goes to New York, and that's where this picture was taken. This is a picture of Sam. He's way over here on the on the bottom. Whoops, that always happens. On the bottom right, he was the youngest artist in this group. He's sitting next to Barnett Newman, who has the hat. He was the only, he was the only youngest artist and the only artist working in Europe in this group. This was a show that, a group that was taken for Vogue magazine, this photograph of a show that started in the Museum of Modern Art. Actually, it premiered in Europe and went around the world and ended at the Museum of Modern Art. And it was to introduce Europe to new American painting. And it also, not pictured in here, is Rothko was in this show, Pollock was in this show. So Sam was showing with these artists. But he was never really part of the New York group. So then from New York, he goes around the world for the first time, and he works in Japan for the first time. And here's Sam working on the next mural he did. It's called the Tokyo mural. He's really fell in love with Japan. He said when he arrived in Japan, it felt like a deja vu. And he, he's wearing a kimono, which is actually not that different, I like to think, from a hospital gown, except a little more elegant. But Sam really preferred to wear very loose clothing when he painted. And he starts working on these big murals that incorporate this very Japanese idea of of white space. And the idea of white space had been sort of percolating a lot in Sam's work before he went to Japan, and which is kind of why he felt like it was a deja vu to be there again, because it was a vocabulary he really recognized. And it's this idea that the white is as important as the form, and the white gives definition to the form. And Ma is kind of like the pause in a line of music, or the breath in a line of poetry. And without that white space, the forms would have no power and meaning. This is a painting called Moby Dick. It's again in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was painted after his first trip to Japan. And again, this is another painting he did right after Japan. It's called Shiny Black. It's in the Guggenheim. And you can see I love this painting for a number of reasons, but one is, the white is so powerful. It looks like a charged waterfall going right through the middle. It's almost optical when you stand in front of it. And then the other thing that's really interesting about this painting is if you look on the sides, the colored shapes on the sides, they're very, they remind you of the way they work like little blocks. They look like the spinal column. And if you look at a lot of Sam's work, he's incorporating a very injured spine into a number of his paintings because, you know, his back problems followed him throughout his life. He was constantly in pain. And he had to have special chairs in his studios. He was always lying down. Even though he was a virtuoso and he was worked nonstop, he was suffered a lot of physical ailments. And here he is again. This is right afterwards in 1960. His spinal tuberculosis reoccurred. This time in his testicles. He had urogenital tuberculosis, testicles of the balls, and he was again almost died and was bedridden for 8 months in the hospital in Switzerland, where he reoriented himself to the canvas. So instead of the canvas being vertical, Sam was, when he was able to eventually work again, he worked on the canvas below him, and he did a series that he became famous for, called Blue Balls. And these are really optical, gorgeous paintings. He didn't do too many. That Sam on the left blowing a bubble. I just love the way those two images work together. But he did these very optical shapes that he thought were a premonition of his illness, but they also have to do with yin and yang, again with white space and colored space, and they're just extraordinary paintings, and the forms are so optical because he's working on them again from the position of them being below him, and he's able to then work on them from above. He eventually goes back. He has to find a new place to live that has a warmer climate. So he leaves Europe, he returns to California. When he arrives in California, he's the most famous artist in the area because, you know, California was then kind of a no man's land. It didn't have like a left bank or a Greenwich Village. And when Sam starts painting again, he actually stops painting for a short, actually a year or two, because if you look at the blue balls, the balls start floating off the canvas and they start disappearing from the canvas, and he doesn't know what's going to take their place. So he starts to become a printer. He becomes a master printer and does a lot of prints. And eventually when he starts painting again, he does these paintings called the Edge series, of which my dad's painting Iris was an early rendition. And these are paintings that have immense contradiction in them, because the white in the center is the most painted surface of the painting. Sam painted that and sanded it and painted that and sanded it, sometimes 7 times. Usually that white is tinted. The color on the edge is just sort of put on later at the end. So the white looks like it's really empty, but it is the most painted surface. Of these paintings, Sam said the center is reserved for you, meaning he meant the viewer. So they're a painting where the artist is really inviting the viewer into the painting. They were difficult paintings for a lot of people because they had so much white space in the middle, but they're really striking and they're really interesting. This is a photograph that's really sort of, again, this is a picture of Sam with his 4th wife, Mako Idemitsu, and their 2 children, Shingo and Osama. And it really reminds me of the Edge paintings in a way because of the white space surrounding them. And they're all going this is towards the end of their marriage, and they're all going off in opposite directions. It's really evocative of the times too, and Mako standing in the middle of that white space of light. Sam was also involved a lot in what was happening down in LA at that time. This is a picture with Sam and Judy Chicago at a happening. I also love this picture because they look like 2 old hippies. Judy Chicago was involved in a lot of happenings and pulled Sam into doing some of them with her. And in this one, he is looking at some airplanes that are, toy airplanes that he had put together with James Turrell, the artist James Turrell, and they were supposed to shoot off colored smoke up in the air, but their airplanes didn't go off. And they wanted to do, a sort of colored air show. Sam had done one that did go off in Japan a few years earlier, and this is an image of it over Tokyo Bay. These aren't toy planes; these are actually planes flown by a group of elite Japanese pilots, and Sam was directing them from the ground, and they were shooting off colored smoke. I think he might have actually, I think in the center, there's a picture of a helicopter, and Sam might have actually been in the helicopter. So he was also involved in, doing some, I would say performative art, some, art where Sam had the desire to paint the heavens. He wanted to, he dreamed of painting all the clouds. He dreamed of the world being his canvas. His ambition was extraordinary. And so here he is trying to paint the sky. He also did a painting. This is a photograph of I guess you would call it a happening or an event he did where he was shooting up canisters of paint on skis. Again, this was done in Tokyo. So now the snow and the ground is the canvas. But Sam's real love was the big white canvas. This is like Sam later in life in his studio in Los Angeles, where he, would stretch out these white canvases. Again, the white was really painted and sanded and painted and gessoed. And then he would roll out strips of water and disperse paint into them. These were the series called the Matrix series. Whoops. Oh, that's not working. Oops. That's one of them. These are beautiful paintings. He did these probably for about 10 years. The lines, get really thick and dark, and they open up and become spacious and full of color. What's really fascinating to me about these paintings is, again, they're talking about different styles of art. So you see like these strips of geometric strip forms that are reminiscent of Mondrian, very rigid. Within those, though, is this chaotic disbursement of color that's almost like a Pollock splatter painting. So he's really bridging two different styles of painting. But Sam continued to be this really restless guy. Oh, there's Sam looking above at the paintings. He just a side note, he had studios all over the world. But in his studio in Santa Monica, he had a cherry picker so he could like go up and look at the paintings. He would go up on ladders. He would ride a bicycle around the work to look at it while he was in motion. So he loved to look at his work from different positions. He was extraordinarily restless. This is Sam with Pontus Holton, who was the first director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. As I said, he was really instrumental in putting LA on the map as an art center. And this is Sam with Robert Shapazian, who was the first director of Lapis Press, which was the publishing company that Sam established to do fine art books. But Sam, of course, he would get really restless. Whatever he set up, he wanted to, in a way, flee from. He said about his personality that he was a great spinner of webs, like almost like a spider. He would spin these webs, but whatever web he spun, he would then want to escape from. So he sets up this whole life in LA and then elopes to Japan with an English woman named Margaret Smith. And so Margaret was his fifth wife. So, he was just, again, this man who was constantly churning, full of desire, full of restlessness. Sam and Margaret eventually returned to California, and eventually they got a house up in Point Reyes. And I'm going to end right there at this point and go back to the beginning, because I think that's enough imagery.
Well, Gabrielle, there's so much we could talk about Sam, but that's why people should buy your book. Because everything you've talked about, this is just a prelude to the fascinating life of Sam. I want to start. Could you unshare your screen?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That way it's just you and I.
I'm sorry.
Let's talk about you and your writing of this wonderful book. How did you start writing in general?
Well, the first thing I did was I went to the Getty. Well, at first I went down and talked to the Sam Francis Foundation.
Oh, sorry, let me interrupt. I mean, like, how did you become a writer?
Oh, how did I become a writer? Um, yeah, that's wow. My mom was a writer, and my dad wrote a lot of art history books. So I grew up around writers all the time. I think I tried to avoid becoming a writer as long as possible, because any kind of art form seemed to me to be really hard and powerful and scary and devotional. So yeah, I avoided it probably until my 30s. I mean, I wrote, but I didn't take it seriously. And then eventually I went back and got my master's and started writing and wrote my first book and published a bunch of essays and wrote my second book. I mean, I did it like you do anything, one step at a time, word by word, letter by letter.
Well, especially when it comes to this book, the process, because it's got so much content coming directly from Sam's life, excerpts from letters he wrote, lots of wonderful photographs from his life. Can we talk about how you started this book? What inspired you?
Well, the stories I had heard really inspired me. So my first book, Unstill Life, each chapter was focused on, or had, in its core, a work of art and an artist that was, because it's a memoir about my life growing up in the art world. They were first artists who were important to my dad, who was this art curator and museum director and art historian, and then became important to me. And Sam was in one of those chapters. I wrote about Sam in one of those chapters. But after I published the book, I found out that a lot of that information that I and every other writer who had ever written about Sam, including my father, and many, many art historians, had perpetuated this sort of self-mythology that Sam had talked about that was not true. And the real interesting stuff about Sam wasn't out there in the world, and so like what really happened to him, why his spinal tuberculosis and the whole story of that. Sam had said he had gone down in an airplane crash. He never went down in an airplane crash. There was no airplane crash. You don't get spinal tuberculosis from a crash, just like you don't get cancer from a car accident. So, why would he spin these tales? Who was he? I was really fascinated and interested in that. So that's kind of what was the spark. I then went down and kind of buried myself in the archives in the Getty. And there were 380 some boxes of material. But the Getty is like a beautiful place to get lost in for a number of years. So that was good. And then I interviewed many, many people, and all Sam's assistants and his dealers and his doctors, and literally everybody I talked about at one point would cry, would burst into tears in the conversation. And there was such extraordinary emotion, love mostly, but who was he? What this story of this incredible, unstoppable force had really, really shaped and shattered people. And it seemed like a perfect character to write about, right? He was designed, he was like a God-given gift, right? He was such an amazing personality.
Yeah, I mean, he's almost mythical.
Yeah.
Just as he was, let alone.
Yeah, he didn't need all the stories, right? But they were part of it, right? And unraveling them. I love to figure things out.
There's so much about the book that I like. One of the things that I particularly enjoy is your sense of place as you write about the different parts of the world that Sam travels in. You evoke Monterey really wonderfully, San Francisco, of course, Paris, and descriptions of not just the weather, but the tiny apartment where he lived and the giant complex that he ended up buying in Santa Monica. And I feel like that is a wonderful connection to Sam's understanding of space in his work.
Well, I went to I started off driving around San Mateo, where his house is still there, with the little redwood tree he planted with his dad, which is now huge. And then I went to Paris. I stayed in the hotel where he was in. I, went up in one of the best experiences was going up into one of those teeny little prop planes that he learned to fly in the Air Corps, because it was a teeny little plane, it's an open airplane. You wear a little leather helmet on, and it's like riding a motorcycle in the sky. I mean, you're really low, you're pretty low to the ground, you can see the earth, and just to have that experience of like sense and wind and taste all coming in through the open cockpit was extraordinary. And I kind of sort of could feel what he must have felt when he had that experience. I went to Japan. I was lucky enough to go to Japan to interview people. That was pretty extraordinary. So I think Switzerland, Amsterdam, it was like a great adventure. It was really wonderful. I got to be Sam, in some sort of shadow form. So it really opened up my horizons. And again, I got to experience, like, all the people I met who knew Sam were so willing and open to talk to me and to, open up their lives. It was like you would say Sam Francis and they'd open the door, and they'd start talking to you and telling you stories. So it was this incredible entree.
I just want to remind folks, please put your questions in the chat. We would love to get them from you. Do you think that people's willingness to talk is sort of an echo of Sam's personality and how people felt about him?
Meeting Sam, rubbing up against Sam, and I know this from my father who knew him and was close to him. My dad bought the gravesite next to Sam. People loved him, and I think they loved him because they wanted to be him, right? He got to live this huge, huge global life. And it started out in a plaster corset, right? It was like he came out of a cocoon and he just flew. And, there's something extraordinarily intoxicating about somebody like that. So, you get next to it and some of that rubs, like the fairy dust rubs off on you. And so it's really powerful. So yeah, I think they loved him. I think they also loved the idea of him, right?
Do you think that Sam was always that way, or that the experience in the hospital was so transformative that charisma, like, was he always that charismatic, or did he just develop that because he was isolated for so long that energy just built inside of him and erupted? Yeah,
I mean, he was, when I read through his letters in high school to his high school sweetheart, Vera, who became his first wife, I mean, they were full of ambition. He was a straight A student. He was on the honor roll. Ambitious in a very almost manipulative, powerful way. So when he met Vera, she belonged to the Methodist Church. Within a week, he had become a member of the church. Within a month, he was the president of the youth group of that church. So, because that's the way he got to be around Vera. So, I mean, that's a lot for a 60-year-old to do. And, when he wanted something, he went after it. So I think the drive was always there. He had a real, he wrote poetry. It wasn't great poetry, or even really good poetry, but he just kind of wrote it and felt free enough to put it out there, to send to his girlfriend, to share. So he had that sort of sense of ego, and a real sense of landscape and appreciation of landscape, and the natural world, which came out in his writing. So I think all of that was there, but I think, that and the facts that what had happened early in his life, this fact that, he nearly escaped death and he was the cause, in a sense, of somebody's death, that he really felt this powerful need to make his life matter, to do something that mattered. And to Sam believed that art should change the world. He truly believed. He didn't know if it did, but he believed it should.
You mentioned the way he connected to the landscape. Sam was one of the first California artists to really make it big on the world stage, I think.
Well, he was the first global artist, so yeah, on the global stage, yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Can you talk about Sam and California? Because they intersect at several different parts in his life.
I think he never really identified himself as a California artist because he really didn't ever want to be codified or branded as anything, right? Not as European, not as New York. So he avoided all of that. And if you look at the style of his painting, he was constantly incorporating, seeding, he was incorporating new kinds of styles and new techniques into his work. So he was constant, he was expansive, he was additive, he didn't want to be contained. But
a better way for me to say this, how did living in California and experiencing California?
Well, he did say that LA, like the light in LA was the best light. I think, I think he really responded to that sort of open bowl of landscape that is the LA basin. It's like a big basin of light. And I think it really opened up his paintings. He started the edge paintings, after moving back to LA, and they are big bowls of light, of space. So he was down there in Santa Monica. He had a studio in Venice on Ashland Avenue, which he then lent to Diebenkorn, and Diebenkorn began his Ocean Park series of paintings that he became famous for in Sam's studio. James Turrell was working down the street doing his first body of work. So they were all working with this idea of light and then trying to incorporate light into their work. So I think in that sense, Sam was definitely a California artist, and he had this giant sense of space, which you get here, right? This big, if you think of his paintings as landscape paintings, yeah, they're definitely influenced by the scale and the grandness of California. And the other thing that's different about California than, say, the East Coast is that we look east, right? We face the east. And so we're always, I think the art of certainly the West Coast is much more influenced by things that were happening in Asia long before they, came over to New York.
Can we talk a bit about what the art world thought of Sam?
Which art world?
Well,
the European art world loved him.
Yeah. What did the critics of the day in the places can you take us through how critics felt about Sam as he moved through the different stages of his work, and how they feel about him today?
Oh, that's a big question. I think, when he first got, so Sam's work, it depends on what body of work you're talking about, but he first got renowned in, the early 50s in Europe, and the European art critics loved him. And even when he was showing in Europe, the New York art critics liked the work. When he brought that same work over to New York and started showing it in New York, they didn't like it anymore because they felt it was too influenced by, 19th century French, or European painting, because Sam was a bridge between the work of, late Monet and what was happening in America. There's an art critic named Paul Schimmel who said that Sam brought the vocabulary of the abstract expressionism to Europe, but filtered through the lens of California. And he did this by making an end run around New York painters. So Sam showed in Paris before Pollock showed in Paris, because he skipped New York. Nobody skipped New York back in then, if you were a painter, you went to New York. And so Sam bypassed New York, and they didn't like that. And when he got to New York, they're like, what are you? Are you European? Are you American? Are you West Coast? Are you East Coast? Are you first generation? Are you second generation? They didn't really know what to do with him. And the other thing that was happening in New York at that time was that America was, and especially New York, was trying to establish itself as the art center of the world, right? Not only the economic, America is the economic center and the political powerhouse of the world, but we had to be the cultural powerhouse of the world. And to do that, we had to, move Paris off the board. And Sam got in the way of doing all that. New York was pretty provincial. It didn't want to look at influences outside of New York. Their work was darker and more muscular. Sam's work was lighter. He was a virtuoso. So what I mean by that is he had a gift. He just had this lyrical hand. He didn't have to work for it. He just picked up paint, and there was a real effort. I'm not saying he didn't work, but it just flowed. It just flowed. And that lyrical hand reminded them too much of the work of, Monet. So it was a struggle for him. Then he went to California. And of course, if you're a California artist, especially then, again, you weren't appreciated by New York because you were Californian. So it was something that he struggled with, I think. But I also think it allowed him to continue to be additive and to really pick up new influences and to have his style continuously evolve.
I think he's one of the first American artists to really incorporate not only the colors and the layout. I guess layout is the wrong word. If you look at Japanese scroll work,
oh yeah,
Sam's paintings of the late 50s and early 60s, you see a similarity of the Ma, and, that was not something that was particularly available.
Yeah, no. In fact, when Sam went there in 1957 for the first time, Japan was just getting back on its feet, right, after the war, and their art scene was just opening back up to the West, right? And so they were longing for something like Sam. And Sam was longing for something like Japan. So it was kind of like this wonderful collision. So they were ready for him. He was ready for them. And he brought legitimacy to Japan, and he, was really influenced by what he saw there and the experience of being there.
So what is the critical take on Sam nowadays?
I think what's really interesting about Sam are a couple of things. One is you look at the surfaces of his paintings are so gorgeous. They are so beautiful that you don't necessarily think and recognize the incredible intelligence behind them. So you stop on the surface. And I think people are looking now today, they're seeing these influences of Asia. I think there's more of a conversation about all those influences and what's going on behind these gorgeous surfaces. And I think Sam was, what makes him really interesting, and I talked to some critics in New York, John Yao, who said, John was one of the first artists legitimate artists like of this caliber that were really looking at what was happening in Asia. And so that's become really important now that the lens of the art world is opening, that somebody was looking at that and thinking about that, in the 1950s. So yeah, I think there's a reevaluation hopefully going on.
I think that you point out you're just pointing out one of the things that I love about your book, which is its exploration of the politics of art. Critical level, but also something like how Norton Simon he said, well, I'll pay for this museum, but only if it shows the picture, only if it displays only the art I like.
Yeah, well,
there's always the
money speaks. My grandma used to say, money speaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about how that influenced the content of your book, like how much of that you wanted to talk about, and whether there's
I grew up hearing the politics of the art world. Whatever I talk about in the book is relates to Sam and the biography of Sam. So I'm not going to, I do talk, it certainly mattered. It certainly is part of like the politics of putting LA on the map as a vital arts community was really important to him. And that was a story that needed to be told. And his involvement with that was fascinating. So I wanted that in print. But yeah, there's, the business side of art world has always fascinated me. So I wanted to talk about that. Sam was a really good businessman. And just like he didn't want to be attached to one wife, he didn't want to be attached to one gallery. He was his own machine. He was like Sam Inc. Incorporated. He had, printing press to do prints with. He had his own lithographer. He had a publishing company. He was he was a force, and he really wanted to keep that power and be his own production.
He founded co-founded the first wind turbine company.
He did, Wind Harvest.
Yeah. So that's another,
Early, I mean, with like somebody was working with Jerry Brown, and and it's still in existence today, by the way. It's
yeah,
about to go public.
for most biographies, my impression of the rhythm is always 3/4 is on the first exciting, or first 2 or 3 exciting parts, and then the last quarter is, and then this happened. But with Sam, that
Doesn't
never
stop.
stops.
Nope.
There's
And
never
even the end was so dramatic. I mean, it was heartbreaking, but really dramatic.
Yeah, I want to encourage everyone who reads the book to just hang on, because the 80s and 90s get very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, he had a whirlwind life, and it was, as much as high as the highs were, the lows were extraordinary. There was a great deal of tragedy.
Well, that's another thing that's kind of the bargain that is struck not only by Sam but also by the members of his family.
Yeah.
You get Sam, but then you also get Sam.
You get the chaos, right?
Yeah, you get the chaos that he just sort of engendered and sometimes fomented. And when you talk to the people in his life, did they feel like that bargain was worth it? Did they feel like what they went through with him? Did they understand how things were in light of who he was?
Worth it. I don't know what, you live your life, and you can't go back and redo what your choices were. So I don't really, didn't speak to anybody who sort of voiced that it wasn't worth it. I know that some of the marriages didn't end well, and that might have been difficult, but they had a kid, or it's like, yeah, I don't know. I think that's a hard question to ask, because I guess it's sort of more interesting to think, was it worth it? Did the creation destroy, did the desire to create destroy what Sam created, in a sense? That's sort of more interesting way to think about it for me.
A couple of questions about the availability of Sam's work in the Bay Area.
Oh, okay.
The artworks are so enormous. Do they make it difficult for our museums to exhibit? And where could we see him here?
Yeah, SF MoMA has work. Anderson Collection has a beautiful painting up right now. Hang on, I'll get to it. I think I have one of the ones, this one. Wait, whoops. Let's share my screen. I think this is on view in the Anderson Collection, Red in Red. And then Berkeley Art Museum has quite a number. I don't know I think they had one in November that was a really beautiful little painting that was up on view in November. They often have some downstairs. So SF MoMA, the DeYoung has one. You can go to LA. LACMA has some gorgeous paintings. So does Mocha. So yeah, there are quite a few places in the Bay Area where you can see them.
Terrific. Question about you. How did you and the University of California Press get together?
My friend
for publishing the book?
Well, okay. I guess so. I was my friend Frances Fiegenspiel introduced me to the press, so that's how I got together with the press. But they were actually the perfect home for the book, because they had published a couple of my dad's books, so I was part of their. They felt like I was family, and I felt like they were family. And they, they're California press, so and he was a California artist, so it really seemed like a really good match. And I really loved the people I worked with there, so it ended up being great.
That's wonderful.
I've never usually asked that question, so.
I think people are just, like you said, Sam's a California person,
Yeah.
and to have this come from the California, the UC Press makes a lot of sense, like you said.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it was the right place for the book.
Why do you think Sam told such tall tales?
Oh,
Question from the audience.
Okay, so which ones? I think, well, Sam was a creator, right? I don't think he, and he thought of himself as sort of a trickster personality, like a conjurer. So I think it was part of his nature. I think around the tuberculosis, and I've done a lot of thinking about that, about why he created that story about an airplane crash for his tuberculosis. So when Sam had tuberculosis was the AIDS of the era. It was infectious. You were confined. You were separated from the community. They didn't have a cure for it. My mother was tubercular, so I grew up with a tubercular person. You didn't talk about it because you could reoccur. You were isolated. So he came out of that situation and he went to Europe, and he was surrounded in Paris by other male artists on the GI Bill who had fought in the war. So the tale might have started spinning because he was telling a tall tale in a room full of guys drinking, or it might have started because he was really uncomfortable divulging the real reason he was in the hospital with the tuberculosis. Eventually, and he told this, no one, until I pulled up his hospital records, knew the truth. Literally, no one, none of his wives, none of his kids. So he told this tale throughout his life. At the very, very end of his life, in one interview, he started to say, somebody at one of the Yves Michaud, a French philosopher, was talking to Sam and asked him about his hospital stay. And Sam said, why call it an accident? It was an illness. And that was the closest he ever got to revealing it. But he died without telling the truth.
Wow. And then he had the other tall tale of crashing.
Yeah, and then he had other tall tales. He loved them. He enjoyed them. He loved fabricating. He was, even when he was in high school, his girlfriend would get mad at him because he would, he said, I'm sorry I tell you these tall tales, but I'm just trying to keep your attention. And in a way, that's what a piece of a painting does, right? It's an invention that's trying to keep to seduce you and keep your attention. And that was him.
Gabrielle, thanks so much for joining us today. Are you doing any other talks that you'd like to talk about? Anything you'd like to plug before we go on our way?
I'm doing a bunch. So if you want, I'm not looking at my calendar right now, but they're on my website under events. So that's an easy way. The website's GabrielleSelz.com.
GabrielleSelz.com. I thought that might be it.
Thank you. That was done really quickly.
Well, you start talking about Sam and it's hard not to keep going.
Yeah.
But quite a lot.
Thank you so much.
Let me tell everyone what's coming up next here at the Friends. So, of course, buy Light on Fire, The Art and Life of Sam Francis. You can get that at Books Inc. and also at bookshop.com. And then, excuse me for just a second. We've got The Bad Muslim Discount by Saeed Masood. That will be our next author event, and it's on February 25th. And speaking of art, we've got 2 great art docent presentations lined up. Next week, we have the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence, and that'll be on February 7th. And we have an Alice Neal retrospective coming up on March 9th. We do great work with art. She's a fantastic arts group, which you can support by donating to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com. And the link in the chat will also take you to a place where you can give us money. I would like to thank the team that makes these events happen. Our great David Beal on the 1s and 2s, Kumar Fonse, and our 3 Karens, Karen Romer, Karen Manuel, and Karen Butter. And a special thanks to you, Gabrielle, for an informative and entertaining program. As always, thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a very good night.